Hi everyone, thank you for clicking on this video. My intent here is hopefully to provide a clear history of the situation in Palestine and Israel and to really focus on the origins of what we call the conflict. My hope is to continue this if there is interest, and please let me know if you have any questions, if there's anything I can expand or clarify. First and foremost, I spent 6 weeks in Israel in 2006 as an undergrad student. I went as an exchange student, very naive and very young, and I studied the history of the modern Middle East, as well as a course called the Jewish-Arab Conflict at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which happens to be in illegally annexed East Jerusalem. So I say I spent time in Israel, but really I spent most of my time in occupied territory. Many of you probably know my background. I have a PhD in governance and globalization. I have a master's degree in international relations, and along with that, a graduate certificate in Middle Eastern affairs. I developed and taught a course at Virginia Tech called The State of Israel, A Political History. And so these materials are very much a consolidation, a synthesis of that course, as well as updating in many ways. And finally, my research. So I've spent a great deal of time thinking about, learning about, talking with people about migration from the Middle East, particularly people who come to the United States as refugees from the Middle East. And so that's my background in the topic. First, it's important to start by understanding what the conflict is and isn't. To start with, first, what the conflict isn't, you have likely heard these ideas in popular discourse, in media, that the conflict is ancient, that it's something that has existed since time immemorial, which makes it difficult or impossible to resolve. This is completely incorrect. It is not an ancient conflict. It does not have roots in prehistory or the Iron Age civilizations that used to live in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's not a conflict about religion. Quite similarly, this is not some kind of intractable doctrinaire argument between religious systems at all. The groups involved largely come from different religious backgrounds, but that is not the motivator or prime driver of the conflict. And finally, then, relatedly, this is not a conflict motivated by anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a largely European phenomenon, and the kind of anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust, for example, does not play a role in the situation in Palestine, Israel, etc. Now, what is the conflict then? It's a modern political conflict. It is a conflict between groups of people who have political goals, and I'll talk more about those in just a moment. And it is a conflict rooted in ethno-nationalism and colonization. And as well, it is an asymmetrical situation. Israel is and has always been the more powerful party in relation to the Palestinians. Now, as I said, this is not an ancient conflict, and that's really important to keep in mind. And so just very briefly, to give a few words on the long history of the region, and I'll refer to it as the Eastern Mediterranean. That's the part of the world we're talking about. It's been peopled by an incredibly diverse array of different groups across its long history of human habitation. And those groups have been overlapping, porous, so people shift between them, and also mytho-historic, groups that we actually don't have as much firm archaeological or recorded history on or information on as we may assume. And those groups, you can see some of them here: Canaanites, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Israelites, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Turks, Armenians, Jews, Christians, Druze, many, many other peoples. Again, intermixing, intermarrying, coming into conflict, coming into cooperation across several thousand years of history and interaction. And so what's really important to understand, the only thing really that matters before the conflict starts in the 1900s, as I'll talk about in just a moment, is that no one group of people has an exclusive or original claim to the lands that we now call Palestine and Israel. The groups that originally inhabited them largely don't exist anymore, and there has never been a single group that has exclusive control over these territories across the history. That's shifted over time as well. To set the context for this modern conflict, this region, the Eastern Mediterranean, you can see a different map of it here, comes to be a part of the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s. And for just about 400 years, the territories we now call Palestine and Israel were part of the Ottoman Empire. So we go to Europe. And in Europe, for many centuries, large numbers of Jews have lived throughout the continent. And they've faced persecution in many cases, very violent persecution, pogroms, expulsions, etc. Really vicious anti-Semitism. And so many Jews in Europe throughout this period and into the 19th century are responding to this anti-Semitism. They're looking for a way to gain safety for themselves and for their communities. And one of the ways, one of the ideas that comes to be called Zionism. And Zionism is, broadly speaking, a Jewish nationalist movement. It's founded, as I said, in Europe in the late 19th century, and it is largely a secular movement of people who consider themselves Jews, who are Jewish culturally, who may or may not go to synagogue or be observant, but are largely secular. It is not a religious movement in its origins. And the Zionists come together and they decide that the way to gain safety for themselves and for other Jews is to leave Europe and find a place for them to have a country of their own, a state of their own, a Jewish homeland. And the most influential elements within this movement, it's varied, it's complex, but within this movement, the factions that are most influential, who come to set the agenda, decide that the goal of this movement will be colonizing then Ottoman Palestine. And this will be the way to guarantee them safety. You can see the picture here. This is Theodor Herzl, who is considered, if you like, the sort of founding father of modern Zionism. And he wrote very influentially and was very involved in this movement at the time. Now, why did the Zionists in Europe choose Ottoman Palestine as the site for a Jewish homeland? They chose it for reasons that are connected to history, to culture, and to religion. That this is a part of the world, the Eastern Mediterranean, where there are these long-standing connections between Jews and Judaism and this part of the world. Now, as I said, they're largely secular, but within any sort of cultural tradition, intermingled with ideas that come to us from various sources, including religion. And so the Torah, the Bible, these kinds of stories about origins of the religion, of the people, are in people's heads. But critically, what's incredibly important to understand, as I said with the early history, there was never an exclusive ownership of this territory by one group. That it changed over time. Various groups claimed ownership of it. That cities like Jerusalem, for example, predate Judaism, was not built by the Israelites or by what comes to be Judaism as we think of it in the modern context. And so these connections that are very real and very important between Jews and Judaism and the Eastern Mediterranean are not the same thing as a political claim to exclusive sovereignty. That people may feel connected to a territory, but that does not necessarily give them the right to take that territory, particularly through violence, and claim exclusive ownership and sovereignty over it. Those are two different things. And it's really important to disentangle those claims that are often conflated. Now, as you may know, we come to the essential problem and the origin of what we call the conflict. So the Zionist movement in Europe decides that their goal will be to colonize Ottoman Palestine, to bring as many Jews as possible to the territory to set up a Jewish country, a Jewish homeland. But the problem, of course, is that Ottoman Palestine was already populated by a different group of people. It was not an empty territory, as old-fashioned sort of propaganda lines say. It was not an empty land. It had many people living there, and those people were primarily Palestinian Arabs. And so you can look at the chart here. In 1882, just about the exact moment of the birth of Zionism, the birth of this goal to colonize this territory, 95% of the population of Ottoman Palestine was Palestinian Arab, and only about 5% of the population was Jewish. And so you then have, as you can imagine, a fundamental problem right from the very beginning of this movement. So then, this is the origin of what we call the conflict. This is the critical moment, and it happens right at the beginning. The Zionist goal and intention to settle, to colonize a territory that was already full of a different group of people. And you can see here a quote from quite a good book by Simcha Flapan, who's a Israeli politician and historian who died a number of years ago. But nevertheless, he says in one of his books, the vision of the great majority of Zionists was always one of a homogeneous Jewish state in the whole, or at least the greater part of Palestine. So the intention was, from the very beginning, to settle the territory, to bring as many people as possible there, and to claim as much of the territory for themselves as possible. And so here we have this critical juncture. This is the origin of the conflict. It is the Zionist decision to colonize Palestine at the expense of the majority population. This is the origin of everything that leads us to October 7th. And unless we understand this, we can't understand what happened on October 7th or anything that happened after it. Now, how did the Zionists pursue this goal? As I said, the goal was to settle Palestine through mass Jewish migration from Europe to Ottoman Palestine, to create a Jewish majority and take control of most or all of the territory. And they did this through a number of means, but you can see here some of the organizations that they founded to facilitate these processes. One, and probably the most important because it still exists, is the Jewish National Fund. We have the Jewish Colonization Association, and the confusingly named, different organization but similar, Palestine Jewish Colonization Association. And this is important to emphasize because one hears in media resistance to the idea that this was a colonial movement, that it was colonization. Indeed, it was colonization. The Zionists themselves talked about it as colonization. They formed organizations with colonization in the name. And you can see here, just as an example, a headline from the New York Times from 1899. It's a conference that was held of Zionists where they met and they decided they will colonize Palestine. So it was a colonial movement from the very beginning, bringing a group of people to a new territory to take control of that territory from the people who already lived there. Now, the Zionist settlers came to Ottoman Palestine and they did a number of different things. In some cases, they bought property. Relatively small amount of property was bought in Ottoman Palestine across the period before the war in 1948 that creates the State of Israel. But one important thing that they did is they created segregated communities. Now, this was not always the case, but many of the Zionist settlers sought to create exclusive institutions, organizations, farms, businesses, etc., that were for Jews only, that either completely excluded the majority Palestinian population or, in some cases, employed Palestinians as low-wage workers on farms and the like. But the idea from the very beginning was to establish new institutions that were exclusively for the use and benefit of the Jewish settlers. And they also expelled Palestinians in some cases from the lands that they had lived on and worked. And so under the kinds of social and economic arrangements in Ottoman Palestine at the time, many people were tenant farmers who farmed on land that they did not own, but they had farmed it for generations. And so when, in the cases that Zionists did buy property, they would often expel Palestinians from those lands. So this question of expulsion becomes crucially important, and again is there from the very beginning of this situation that we call the conflict. And one of the ways that this was talked about throughout the history is the idea, this euphemism of transfer. And so you can see here Benny Morris, an Israeli historian, says on the most basic level, Jewish colonization meant expropriation and displacement of Palestinians. That from the 1880s onward, there was this idea of transfer, which is a euphemism for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and it's circulated throughout Zionist thought and practice. And so you can see here just one example from David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, and a really important figure in the pre-state history of what becomes Israel, and a leader of the Zionist labor left. And so he told a meeting of the Jewish Agency in 1938, I support compulsory transfer. I do not see in it anything immoral. And so what transfer means, quite simply, is pushing out, getting rid of Palestinians, moving them from the territories that the Zionists wanted somewhere else. And the somewhere else didn't really matter. So you can see here, this is quite clearly a euphemism for ethnic cleansing. Getting rid of one group because they belong to a different ethnicity to make room for the dominant ethnicity, in this case, Jewish Zionists. Now, from the 1880s onwards, the Zionist settlers set about, as I said, creating parallel institutions, organizing themselves politically, economically, and militarily. They started doing things like manufacturing their own weapons and arming themselves. They were also importing weapons into the territory illegally. They were forming militias and what we would call in modern parlance terror cells. And they were training for conflict. And so you can see here the symbol of the major group, the most important group, the Haganah, which is the militia that becomes the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli military, after the war in 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel. So, as the Zionist project to colonize Ottoman Palestine proceeded from the 1880s onward, of course we have other things happening in the world. And an important juncture here is the transition after World War I from Ottoman Palestine to British Palestine. So in World War I, the Ottoman Empire fights against the British and the French, and they lose. And the British and the French empires come together and basically meet and decide what will happen to the territories of the former Ottoman Empire. And so after the war, the kind of core of the Ottoman Empire becomes modern-day Turkey. You can see it on this map in sort of greenish gold. And the French take control of what becomes Syria and Lebanon, and the British take control of what become Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. And within that, the British do a number of things. They set up monarchies in Iraq and in Jordan, basically decide here this family will be the king, and a pair of brothers become king in Iraq and in Jordan. And in what becomes Israel and Palestine, under the auspices of the League of Nations, the sort of precursor to the United Nations, the British take control of this territory as what's called a mandate. And the idea is this is a territory that at some point will become independent, but is not ready for independence yet. So it is a quasi-colonial, sort of quasi-imperialist status that this territory has, deeply rooted racism and colonial attitudes that the natives are not ready for democracy or independence, and we, the British, have to teach them how to become modern political agents and subjects. And so, in any case, Ottoman Empire is dissolved. The British take control of what becomes Palestine, Israel, Jordan, and Iraq. What becomes Palestine, Israel, and Jordan are sort of one territory, and Jordan is split off and eventually becomes its own country, and we are left with mandatory Palestine, the territories we know today as Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, which include the West Bank and Gaza. So you can see here a little closer up on the map, you have there on the Mediterranean Palestine in green, and above that Lebanon. And the mandate goes on from 1920 until 1948. And in this period, it is a period of increasing violence, that you have a series of uprisings against against foreign British control, as well as intercommunal struggles. So violence between the majority Palestinian Arab population and the minority settler Zionist Jewish population. And so you have a series of uprisings. You have a Palestinian uprising against the Zionists and the British. You have Zionist violence against Palestinians and the British. And you have a situation of attacks, reprisals, and counter reprisals. And so you can see here just an example of some of this violence on this slide. You have another example of one of the militias formed by the Zionists, the Irgun, and their symbol here, as well as the remnants or the aftermath of a bombing committed by the Zionists of the King David Hotel, targeting British colonial forces, or administrators really. And it killed a large number of people. So a terror attack that was done by the Zionist militias. Interestingly, you can see here on the Irgun symbol, if you notice in the middle, it's an arm clutching a rifle, which is a very common symbol in sort of militant groups around the world. But behind that is a map, and that map is what we think of as modern-day Israel and Palestine, but also Jordan. So you can see here the Zionists were claiming a large amount of territory. Many of the groups wanted not only what becomes Israel as the territory, but also wanted to take large parts of modern-day Jordan, parts of modern-day Lebanon, and also parts of modern-day Egypt. So there were maximalists who thought even more territory should be controlled by the Zionists and eventually the state of Israel. So in this period, 1920 to 1948, there were multiple attempts by the British to impose partition on the territory and on the people living in it. And so in 1937, there's something called the Peel Commission, which recommends partitioning the territory between the Palestinian Arabs and the Zionists, the Jewish communities, and it's rejected by the Palestinians. And later in 1947, you have, under the new United Nations, a partition plan that is passed by the United Nations General Assembly. Now, it's really important to understand that General Assembly resolutions are non-binding. So this is a recommendation. It was not and did not have the full force of international law. It was a recommendation by the UN, a UN that was very much, and still is, controlled by the Allied powers, the United States, the British, the French, and several others. And so in 1947, the Zionists strategically accept partition with the understanding that we will accept it now and take more territory later. And the Palestinians, quite understandably, rejected partition. They were still the overwhelming majority in the territory. By 1947, the population was roughly 30% Jewish and 70% Palestinian. And the partition plan would have given a smaller territory to the Palestinians and more land to the much smaller minority Jewish community, Zionist community. And so the Palestinians rejected it. Partition is rejected. And in 1947, in December, very soon after partition is rejected, Palestinian irregulars strike first, essentially, and war begins. But as I said, the Zionists had been preparing for years for what they saw as an inevitable conflict. And in 1947, the Zionists were better organized, better trained, and better armed than the Palestinians. They also eventually had advantages in manpower as well. And so the war has two phases. The first is the Palestinian majority population of the territory fighting against the Zionist forces. Very quickly, the Zionist forces defeated the relatively uncoordinated, untrained forces, if you can call them that, of the Palestinians. And in the second phase of the conflict, the Zionists fought many of the neighboring countries, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and several others. And in this conflict, the Zionists prevail as well, defeating those countries. Those countries were relatively unorganized. Israel had made a secret agreement with Jordan, essentially that Jordan would take control of what we now call the West Bank, and there wouldn't be much fighting between those forces. And as I said, the Zionists were not only better armed and better trained than the Palestinian population, but their forces were one cohesive military force, broadly speaking, against the relatively uncoordinated forces of multiple countries, relatively weak forces, working at cross purposes in some cases. And so it is a violent conflict. Many people are killed on all sides, but the Zionists win the conflict. And so we come to yet another critical moment in the history to understand. If you do genuinely want to understand what happened on October 7th, why is there fighting today? And that is, starting in 1947, as the conflict begins, you have ethnic cleansing. The Zionist forces set about pushing out many Palestinians from their homes, pushing them to neighboring countries, to other parts of Palestine, particularly Gaza. And so during the war from 1947 to 1949, something like 750,000 Palestinians, 80% of the Palestinian population, are ethnically cleansed from what becomes Israel. So one thing to understand about the partition plan is that even under the partition plan, Palestinians would have been a large plurality in the Jewish state because they were a much larger population of the territory. And so during the war in 1947-49, the Zionist militias force 750,000 Palestinians to leave their homes and go elsewhere. Some people leave because they're afraid of violence. Some people leave because the Zionist forces came in and massacred people and pushed people out at the point of a rifle. The most famous example of this is the Deir Yassin massacre. And so, as I said, Palestinians leave their homes. Many of them go to Gaza. Many of them go to neighboring countries. And so today, in 2024, 70% of the population of Gaza are refugees and their descendants from the people who were ethnically cleansed from what became Israel in 1947 to 1949. And not only were the majority of the Palestinian population pushed out of what became Israel, but then the pre-state militias, terror cells, and eventually the Israeli military, after the state is established, set about destroying the homes of the people who were ethnically cleansed. And so in total, something like 500 Palestinian villages were depopulated and destroyed by the Zionist forces. You can see here on the map where this happened, all over what becomes Israel. And so people were kicked out, homes were dynamited, were blown up, were burned to the ground, paved over, and so forth. And this was a strategy to prevent Palestinians from returning to their homes. You can see here a picture of a Palestinian village that was depopulated in 1947-49. It looks from the picture like some ancient ruin, but it's not. These are people's homes, some of whom may indeed still be alive, living in Gaza or a refugee camp in Lebanon or somewhere else. And so one of the elements here is that there has been, since 1947, a project of cultural genocide against Palestinians by the Zionist forces and later by Israel. The Palestinian villages that were destroyed, you can see here, were erased, and we come back to the Jewish National Fund, an organization that still exists. And one of the ways in which Israel has created a sense that the country belongs to them, never belonged to the Palestinians, is to literally bulldoze and plant over and build over the history of Palestine. And so the Jewish National Fund is famous for planting trees in Israel. Some of you may have seen donation forms to do this. And many of the forests that the Jewish National Fund has planted have been planted over the ruins of Palestinian villages. And as I said, this was an intentional strategy and project to change the physical landscape and geography of the country to make it appear as though Palestine never existed. The people who lived there never existed. And this is what is called cultural genocide. We see other elements of this too, renaming locations from Arabic to Hebrew, renaming street signs, streets, these sorts of things as well. When 750,000 Palestinians were kicked out of their homes, forced to leave for Gaza or elsewhere, they were permanently barred from ever returning to their homes. And as I said, many of their homes no longer exist. because they were destroyed by Israel. And this is a violation of well-established international law, that people who become refugees when conflicts end typically return to their homes, are allowed to return to their homes. But in the case of Palestinians, Israel never allowed them to return to their homes. You can see here several people holding keys, and this becomes a very important symbol for Palestinians, the key. Sometimes people will wear it around their neck from their homes. Because again, this is not ancient history. This is something that happened within the lifetime of many people. My own dad is older than the state of Israel, for example. This is not something ancient, but is something within the living memory of many people still alive. And so Palestinians were barred from ever returning to their homes. Major violation of international law by Israel. And this is a crucial reason why there is still conflict in this part of the world. That the people who were made refugees ended up in refugee camps. If they ended up in Jordan, they eventually became citizens, but that was the exception and not the rule. And they have lived their lives for multiple generations as refugees, never able to return to their homes, never having compensation for having had their homes taken and destroyed. And so this denial of the right of return is a critical element to continued conflict. And there's another piece to this that's really important to understand. And it is one of the major reasons why people say that Israel is an apartheid state. And that is that the laws are different for people based on their ethnicity. That Palestinians who were born in what is now Israel and ethnically cleansed in 1948 can never return. They were stripped of any chance of citizenship or belonging to the place where they had been born, their parents, their grandparents for many hundreds or indeed thousands of years. At the same time, anyone Jewish from anywhere in the world can move to Israel and become a citizen immediately. And so people who were born there, who happen to be Palestinian, the wrong ethnicity, can never return. But people of a different ethnic group, ethno-religious group, Jews, can move there and become citizens, and the state will provide you with a number of benefits, financial, educational, etc. And this is even true of converts to Judaism with no historical connections to the land. So someone with no connection to the territory can do this, whereas people who are actually born there cannot. And this is fundamentally unequal because it is based on ethnicity, one ethnicity having more rights and privileges than another. That basically is the culmination of the first half of the history of the State of Israel. It begins in the 1880s, and we come to 1948, the establishment of Israel as a country. You can see here on the map, Israel in the light color and the surrounding countries. In the war in 1948, those are the territories that Israel takes. Egypt takes control of the Gaza Strip, and Jordan takes control of the West Bank. And so just to very briefly reiterate the history I've just run through, Jews in Europe facing persecution, facing very serious anti-Semitism, are looking for a way to gain safety. And one of the groups, not all Jews, but some, decide the way to do that is to leave Europe and go somewhere else and create a Jewish homeland. And the Zionists settle on the territory of Ottoman Palestine. And they begin to settle that territory, even though it has a population that is overwhelmingly Palestinian Arab already living there. And they set about creating separate institutions, arming themselves, preparing for an eventual conflict that they were well aware was unavoidable, that they were trying to settle and colonize a territory with a group of people that didn't want someone else to take the territory from them. All of that leads to conflict between the two groups, increasing Jewish migration to Ottoman and then British Palestine, and finally the war in 1947, where Israel ethnically cleanses most of the Palestinians from what becomes Israel. They become refugees, and the state is established. With that history in mind, let me then reiterate and summarize the key point to understand if you want to understand how we got to October 7th. And that is, from the very beginning, at every point, it is the Zionists and later the State of Israel that are the aggressors in what we call the conflict. At every point, Palestinians are responding to Zionist and Israeli violence and attempts to take control of more and more territory. The Zionists intentionally sought to colonize a territory already full of people. They sought to change the demographics of Ottoman Palestine from majority Palestinian, overwhelming majority, to a Jewish majority, and thereby take over and create a Jewish country, state, etc. To do this, they created segregated institutions where they excluded and expelled Palestinians. Later, they ethnically cleansed 750,000 Palestinians from what became Israel, and then denied all of these people the right to return to their homes, and indeed, they destroyed many of their homes. And as we get to the post-1948 history, Israel continues to subjugate millions of Palestinians, and they continue to annex more territory and expand both de jure and de facto the borders of their country, taking more and more territory. And so in order to understand why it is that October 7th happened, you have to understand all of this history. Palestinians are colonized and subjugated by Israel and are responding to that colonization and that subjugation.